There's an old man who lives at the edge of town. No one really knows his name. He walks alone every morning, slow, deliberate steps like each one means something. He doesn't wave, doesn't smile much, doesn't ask for anything. But if you look closely, there's peace in his eyes, the kind of peace you don't fake, the kind that comes from having seen too much, lost too much, and somehow understood it all. They say he's lonely, that he's sad, that being alone at that age is a sign of decline, a quiet tragedy. But what if they're wrong? What if he isn't lonely at all? What if he's finally free? After 65, something begins to change. The noise of the world grows quieter, not because the world slows down, but because you do, not in weakness, but in wisdom. You start to see through the masks, through the rush, through the shallow conversations. You no longer feel the need to fill silences with small talk or prove your worth through busy calendars. Instead, you begin to crave space, stillness, clarity, and for the first time, you're not afraid of your own company. In fact, it comforts you more than most people ever could. But society doesn't get that. They call it isolation. They fear what they don't understand. Yet throughout history, the wisest people, saints, sages, poets, all disappeared into solitude before they found truth. And maybe, just maybe, you're doing the same. So if you're 65 or older and you prefer to be alone, this isn't something to fix, it's something to honor, because that space you've created for yourself, that silence you've embraced, it might just be the sound of wisdom echoing back. Not everyone who walks alone is lost. Some are just finally coming home. It's easy to think people become quiet because they're tired. But the truth is, sometimes people become quiet because they're finally awake. You don't reach your 70s without learning what noise truly costs. The noise of fake friendships, of shallow praise, of conversations that go nowhere and take too much from you. And so, one day you stop seeking it. You don't need to be seen to feel real anymore. You don't need approval to know your worth. That's not loneliness. That's evolution. The psychology of solitude is misunderstood by those still chasing the world. But for those who have lived long enough, solitude isn't punishment. It's a sanctuary. Psychologists call it emotional differentiation. The ability to stand on your own emotional ground without being shaken by other people's chaos. In youth, we measure life by how many people we can gather around us. In old age, we measure it by how much peace we can protect inside us. Some might call it withdrawal, but in truth, it's a return to the self, a rediscovery of something that was always there, just buried under decades of being busy. Think of all the times you silenced your own thoughts just to fit in. Think of the dinners, the conversations, the events, where your soul whispered, "This isn't for me," but you smiled anyway. Now finally, you no longer betray yourself for company. You choose peace over performance, depth over drama. Science supports it too. Studies show that many seniors who seek solitude aren't antisocial, they're internally fulfilled. They've developed something rare, self-containment, the ability to sit in a quiet room and still feel whole. That kind of strength doesn't shout, it simply is. So the next time someone asks, "Why don't you go out more?" or "Don't you get lonely?" you can answer with a gentle smile. Because you know something they don't. Being alone doesn't mean you're empty. It means you're finally full of something real. And yet, this silence, this peace, this sacred stillness, it isn't just psychological. Sometimes it speaks of something even deeper, something spiritual. There comes a moment in life when you stop trying to explain yourself, not because you've given up, but because you finally realize the people who truly understand you don't need explanations. That's when silence begins to bloom, not as absence but as presence, as power. In your younger years, you believed wisdom had to be loud, that to matter, your voice had to rise above the noise, that you had to argue to convince to be right. But time teaches a quieter lesson. You realize that the wisest people often say the least, not because they lack opinions, but because they know how rare and sacred true words should be. A wise elder doesn't need to interrupt. They listen, they wait, They watch what others miss. And when they finally speak, it's never to impress, it's to illuminate. Silence after 65 is not a void, it is a language, a declaration, a quiet revolution against a world obsessed with noise. You begin to understand that most things don't need your reaction. That wisdom often means knowing what not to say. You stop arguing with people who don't want to grow. You stop trying to be understood by those committed to misunderstanding. And in that space, you find peace, and in that peace, you find truth. The great sages, the monks in mountains, the old women who sit quietly by their gardens, they all share this one silent thread. They've seen enough, and they've stopped pretending that most of the world's chaos is worth responding to. Silence becomes a kind of prayer, a sacred boundary, a way of telling the world, I've made peace with myself. I don't need to win this conversation. And in that space, where words fall away, something far more powerful begins to speak. Presence, integrity, depth, the kind of wisdom that doesn't need applause, because it's already rooted in something eternal. So if you found yourself quieter with age, don't apologize. Don't let anyone rush your words. Your silence is not empty. It's earned. It's the voice of every lesson life has ever taught you, whispering back to you in stillness. And sometimes, the quietest people in the room are the ones carrying the loudest truths. There is a kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It feels holy. When you reach a certain age, being alone stops feeling like isolation. It begins to feel like invitation, an invitation to turn inward, to listen, not to the world, but to your soul. And that is where the real journey begins. The greatest spiritual teachers, from Jesus in the desert to Buddha beneath the tree, to the wise elders who disappear into the hills, all found God not in noise, but in solitude. Because when there is no one else to perform for, no conversation to distract you, no role to play, you finally face the most sacred presence of all, your true self. In youth, you may have prayed out loud. In old age, your prayer becomes a breath, a gaze, a quiet awareness of life moving through you. When you're alone, not lonely, but truly alone, you begin to feel connected in a different way, not outwardly to people, but inwardly to everything. The wind feels like a message. The silence becomes a teacher. You no longer chase meaning. You become meaning. There is a kind of wisdom that only grows in quiet soil, a kind of peace that only blooms after the storms of youth have passed. And in that silence, you don't feel empty. You feel held, as if the universe itself has pulled up a chair beside you and said, you don't have to prove anything anymore. You are already enough. For many elders, solitude is not just peace. It is prayer. Every moment becomes sacred. Every sip of tea, every walk in the garden, every glance at the morning light. It all becomes a kind of worship. And the beauty of this spiritual depth, it asks for nothing. It demands no show. It welcomes you just as you are. Tired, quiet, unfinished, but real. In a world that measures worth by noise and activity, there is something deeply rebellious and beautifully sacred about choosing stillness. In solitude, you are not separate from life. You are finally aligned with it. Being alone might just be the closest you ever get to God. There is a peculiar kind of sadness in being misunderstood, and for many elders who prefer solitude, that misunderstanding follows them everywhere. Like a shadow no one bothers to examine. She must be lonely. He probably has no friends. They should get out more. These are the whispers people speak as if they're caring, but really, they're projecting. Society has trained us to equate being alone with being broken. We're told that if you're not surrounded by people, something must be wrong with you. That silence is a symptom. That choosing solitude is the same as surrendering to sadness. But what if we've got it all backwards? What if the ones who sit quietly at home are not weak but free? What if the solitary elder is not someone to pity, but someone to learn from? You see, the world misunderstands you because it fears what you've embraced. It fears silence because it reveals truth. It fears solitude because it requires self-confrontation. It fears independence because it cannot control it. A person who no longer needs the validation of others is the most powerful person of all. But society doesn't know what to do with someone it cannot label. It's easier to say, "You're lonely," than to ask, "Have you simply outgrown the noise?" They don't see the inner richness, the quiet routines that bring you peace, the long afternoons spent in thought, the walks without conversation that feel like communion with the earth. They miss the deep wisdom in your eyes, the layers of letting go, the quiet pride in having nothing left to prove. You've stopped chasing gatherings that feel hollow. You've stopped forcing connections that drain your spirit. You no longer need to show up everywhere to feel seen. But society, still frantic in its hunger for performance, can't grasp that your retreat is not a wound. It's a choice. Perhaps that's the greatest rebellion of all, to grow old, and no longer ask for permission to be whole on your own terms, to walk away from what doesn't nourish you, to stop explaining yourself to people who never listened, to stand in your own light quietly, firmly, peacefully, and if they still don't understand, that's all right. You do. Being misunderstood is a small price to pay for finally understanding yourself. There comes a time in life when making noise no longer feels necessary, when showing up everywhere no longer feels urgent, when the world starts rushing faster, and you, for the first time, feel no need to keep up. This is not weakness, it is wisdom, and it is here in this quiet stepping back that something beautiful begins to unfold. Legacy. Legacy is not built in crowds. It is shaped in the unseen moments. The way you lived, the values you passed down, the love you gave when no one was watching. It's in your daughter's quiet strength, in your grandson's calm gaze, in the neighbor who remembers your kind smile on a lonely day. You withdraw from the noise, but your impact echoes louder than ever. Many fear that withdrawing means fading, but in truth it often means crystallizing. You become more focused, more distilled, like the final, richest note of a lifelong song. Your purpose no longer comes from being busy, it comes from being intentional, a phone call that matters, a single piece of advice that shapes a life, a smile to a stranger who didn't know they needed it. That is the power of quiet presence. You don't say much anymore, but when you do, it carries the weight of 1,000 pages. The wisdom of withdrawal is not about vanishing. It's about recalibrating, redirecting your energy inward, toward the soul, toward the eternal, toward the questions that really matter now. What am I leaving behind? What truth am I embodying? What kind of ancestor will I be? And perhaps most importantly, have I become the person I once needed? The world often celebrates constant motion, but forgets that the most meaningful acts happen in stillness. A candle doesn't need to dance to offer light. It just needs to burn steadily. And that is you now. Steady, silent, deeply bright. You may no longer seek to influence the world directly. But make no mistake, your very presence is shaping it quietly. Through your restraint, your perspective, your example, and that is purpose in its highest form. When you withdraw from the world, you finally become part of something much larger than it. In a world that never stops talking, the choice to be alone can seem like an act of courage. But those of us who have walked this path know the truth. Solitude is not loneliness, it is liberation. To embrace silence, to cherish your own company, to find joy in your own thoughts. This is a power few ever discover. You have journeyed through life's noise, navigated its storms and celebrations. And now in this chapter, you've found a new kind of strength. The strength that comes from within. It is a strength that does not demand applause. It does not seek validation. It simply is quiet, steady, unshakable. The wisdom of solitude is a gift, a sanctuary. In it, you meet yourself fully. You listen to the whispers of your heart, and you discover the depths of your own soul. So, if you are 65 or older, and you find comfort in being alone, celebrate it. You are wise beyond measure. You have chosen a path of peace, clarity, and truth. And in this choice, you embody a timeless lesson for us all. That true fulfillment doesn't come from the crowd. It comes from the courage to stand alone and to love yourself fully in the silence. Remember, being alone is not the absence of love. It is the presence of self-love, the beginning of freedom, and the purest form of wisdom. Walk this path with pride, and know that in the quiet you shine brighter than any spotlight ever could. Thank you for sharing this moment. May your solitude be rich, your heart be full, and your days be lived with quiet, profound joy.